Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. Let us begin. I'm Greg Coleridge, Move to Amend co-director, and welcome everyone to what will certainly be a very stimulating program on lessons on how to amend the Constitution and how they apply to today's constitutional crisis. And it is a crisis. A few logistics first. You're all muted. If you wish to ask a question or make a comment after the presentation, please add it to the chat anytime. Alfonso Saldana, who's Move to Amend co-director, will monitor the chat and then share those questions or comments at the end. Before turning it over to John Fioretta to introduce our speaker, Professor Wilfred Codrington III, a word on Move to Amend for those who may not know us. Move to Amend is a national grassroots campaign seeking to abolish two profoundly undemocratic constitutional judge-made doctrines that a corporation is a person and money equals free speech, about as bizarre as they come. We are organizing to enact the We the People Amendment, HJR 54, in the current congressional session, which is one of many amendments needed to create authentic democracy in this country, we believe, for the very first time. Our organizational values include a commitment to political and economic independence, movement building, community, transparency, accountability, and anti-oppression, both internally and externally. Support for our effort includes, as of today, 68 U.S. congressional representatives, more than 520,000 individuals, over 800 organizations, and 725 municipal resolutions or citizen-driven ballot initiatives. If you aren't yet educating, advocating, and organizing with us, what are you waiting for? Hit us up at info@movetoamend.org and we'll get you involved in doing democratic good trouble. I now turn it over to John Fioretta, chair of Move to Amend's Law and Research Committee and central figure in arranging this program, to introduce our speaker. John?
Thanks, Greg. Hello, everybody. This introduction abbreviates our speaker's substantial and impressive qualifications. Wilfred Codrington is a constitutional law professor at the Cardozo Law School in New York City. In addition to teaching at several other law schools, he has published academic papers in the likes of Columbia Law Review Forum and the Harvard Law and Policy Review, as well as media outlets of great repute like The Atlantic. Prior to entering the academic world, the professor was a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, where he served as counsel for the Brennan Center's democracy program. He worked as an attorney at the Campaign Law Center. He served as staff for U.S. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, and he clerked for the Honorable Deborah Ann Batts, U.S. District Judge for the Southern District of New York, who was the first openly gay member of the federal judiciary. He is the first generation of his family to graduate from college, in his case, Brown University, and also holds a master's in public administration from the University of Pennsylvania and a JD from Stanford. In 2021, he authored The People's Constitution, 200 Years, 27 Amendments, and the Promise of a More Perfect Union. And the jacket looks like this, which is eminently readable for lay people, even though it works for lawyers as well. Our topic today is what we can learn from past efforts to amend the U.S. Constitution and how they apply to today's constitutional crisis. Professor Codrington will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, and the rest of our time will be Q&A. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We're going to see if we have connected with the professor yet. He's at a conference in Dallas, and his flight was over 2 hours late in getting there. So we may have to wait for just a little bit before he connects with us. In the meantime, I'll give you a quick rundown on his book. The basic premise is that if you look at the constitutional amendments that have been passed, they've been passed in groups. And the first group was our Bill of Rights, followed by a couple of, I would term cleanup amendments. One had to do with the Electoral College and another had to do with the federal court jurisdiction issue. So that was the first group. The second group were the amendments after the Civil War, and that's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And the 13th abolished slavery. The 14th established equal protection and due process under the law, as well as dealt with some issues from the Civil War. And the 15th guaranteed the vote to freed Black men. That was the second group. The third group happened roughly at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, excuse me, end of the 1800s, beginning of 1900s, and they had to do with things like the income tax, giving women the vote, prohibition, and
Direct election.
thank you, direct election of senators. And that was a result of the Gilded Age, which led to the Progressive Era. And the next group of amendments were those occurring in the early 60s, and those had to do with voting rights and the like. So there are definite periods in history when there are a group of constitutional amendments, and then we go for a fairly long time. We're talking decades before the next group comes along. And I think what the professor will tell us when he gets here is that we're long overdue for one of them. He will also hopefully talk about the conditions that are needed or generally occur when amendments are passed. And once again, we're in one of them right now in terms of technological innovation, social polarization, and the like. So we're not only overdue, the conditions are ripe, and we will hopefully hear from him very soon. And in the meantime, now that you have some sense of what this is going to be about, hopefully you can prepare your questions and get them to Alfonso.
John?
Yes, Professor Codrington, sorry about your mishaps with the air transportation system today, but we're really glad that you made it. I've already introduced you, and in the time I gave them a brief, very brief summary, not as good as you would have done, of your book. So they know the basic gist of constitutional amendments coming in waves, decades apart and that kind of thing. So and there's been a brief discussion about the fact that there's a movement afoot now for more of an open convention to handle more constitutional amendments than just one or a couple, and actually revisit the entire document. So with that as background, wonderful to see you. Thank you for being here, and welcome to Move to Amend.
Hey, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So sorry, everybody, for the delay. I'm in a hotel right now. My planes just were canceled and delayed. And so, again, thank you for having me, John. You've been patient over the course of an extremely busy year for me, professionally and personally. So thank you. And then over the course of today with all the air travel mishaps. But most importantly, thank you, John and Greg and everyone here at Move to Amend for all the work you're doing in pursuit of the solution for this problem that plagues us, which is the potent force of money in politics. And so I just want to start with something that you are likely to know, especially if John gave a little overview of me and my work, and what you're working on. So it is extraordinarily difficult to amend the Constitution, at least formally. So we have this sort of, as professors, we think about the idea of informal amendments happening too, but for the actual textual change to the Constitution, that is quite difficult. Article 5, our amending provision, sets out these arduous procedures, demanding consensus, extraordinary consensus at two levels, right? So we need 2/3 of the members of the House of Representatives and Senate to agree to propose an amendment, and then ratification by 3/4 of the states. And, you know, in this day and age, that seems pretty high, right? And so from the works of all the scholars, their empirical work, their historical work, their theoretical work, and otherwise, the Constitution of the United States has been pronounced pretty much the most difficult constitution in the world to amend. And yet it has been amended. It's been amended more than 2,000 times, and it's been amended in ways that have resulted in 66% more of the text than there was when it was originally inked in 1787. And so what I've been grappling with, I'm sure what you are grappling with, is one, how that has happened, and two, whether that sort of change is possible today. And so in my book, The People's Constitution, that is a largely historical book, and it covers a lot of the how. It's largely a historical book, but it also offers critical analysis of Article 5 and some insights into the amendment successes and the key failed efforts at constitutional change. And so ultimately, my co-author and I observed that there are 5 phenomena that are typically presented at times when we actually have constitutional amendment and it prevails. And so the big one I will mention before talking about ones that are important to you. Actually, they're all important to you if we think about it, but the big one has been Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, for example, has helped to catalyze constitutional amendments on many occasions, with new provisions being added to displace or supplant these misguided judgments in decision-making by the High Court. And so, for example, we can think about the Reconstruction Amendments, right? They effectuated the overruling of Dred Scott versus Sanford, and that is to say that our 13th Amendment, our 14th Amendment, our 15th Amendment, they were all adopted to disprove of Chief Justice Taney's claim in that decision that Black people possessed no rights that the white man was bound to respect. And so they did this through emancipation and the promise of equal standing before the law and government non-discrimination, particularly in the areas of political rights and voting. And so while it's not, or perhaps it's not as odious, I do want to be thoughtful about making these comparisons. But, you know, you guys are working against a backdrop and to uproot some pretty pernicious Supreme Court decisions. Buckley versus Vallejo, Citizens United. These are important decisions that have changed the landscape of U.S. politics and U.S. law. And so that sort of thing is one of the things that have catalyzed constitutional amendments. Also, they have materialized in times after extreme political polarization. And so, for example, and I'm going to use some of these examples more than once because these examples actually fit a number of these categories. So there's a lot of overlap. I mean, we have just a few different amendments when you kind of think about them. But the 16th Amendment, that followed this period. In the progressive era, it came when you had consistent swings in party control over Congress. You had a couple of electoral college misfires that made presidents out of popular vote losers. And so, again, that sort of was symbolic or significant, but that was the nature of political polarization. And on the heels of that, we saw constitutional change. And then to the one that I think is probably the most relevant to you, or at least certainly the most relevant for the purpose of this talk, and that is social movements and political movements turned constitutional movements. And that gets to the title of this event. And so amendments are often coming on the heels of this widespread activism and protest, advocacy and unrest. And these are amendments coming amidst these movements, contentious and conflict amongst social forces and political forces. And we've seen those sorts of movements, that sort of organization able to impel some of the most important and fundamental constitutional change we have known. And so, again, the 13th Amendment, perhaps the most clearest example, because that came on the heels or in the sort of shadow of the abolition movement, right? And so we have that. We have the 18th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, those being ratified sort of as parts of large movements. And then if you think about the amendments that came during the civil rights era, those were also products of the extreme unrest and activity of that era to fight racial injustice and America's system of racial apartheid. And so when we really think about this, these social movements have been around catalyzing some of the most important amendments we have known and had, and ever since the Bill of Rights, right? The Bill of Rights was largely a sort of government-run activity period to try to fix a government that was on the brink. But beyond that period, those first 10 amendments plus the 11 and 12 that came in that era, it was social movements that was driving all of this stuff. And so the late Professor Lonnie Grenier and her co-author Gerald Torres once wrote that the leaders of political institutions get their courage to act from the people themselves. And that people themselves is important. That is the we the people in the Constitution. And so what they're saying there, and coming from their own perspectives, Gerald Torres thinking about sort of environmental movements, Lonnie Grenier thinking about racial justice and voting rights, what they're saying is it takes a movement. In the sort of choice words of this evening's organizers, it takes this movement to foster constitutional change, and particularly in our system of government that is characterized by representative democracy. And so we, the people, again, to steal from this organization, must move to amend. We must move to have social organization and activity turn to this political organization and activity and sort of elevated to this constitutional movement, that organization and activity, if we are to move those otherwise seemingly unmovable lawmakers, to propel them into the activity, the extraordinary activity that's required to change the Constitution. And so that's kind of the context for how I think about movements. And that's, you know, I've written about this in various different places and spoke about this in various different events. But one thing I've been thinking about are some of the key takeaways I've gotten from this. And so I've come to think about this as at least 3 S's being at play here. Or at least 3 S's that we should be thinking about to guide movements today. And so one of the S's is called synchronicity, right? Synchronicity, this first point stems from the work of Carl Jung. He had this theory of synchronicity, which concerns the occurrence of acausal connected events. And so in Jung's field of psychology, synchronicity referred to the ties between the mind, particularly the subconscious, and the unfolding of events externally, so in the real world. And so, for example, you might think about it like this. You wake up from a nap, You've been dreaming about butterflies for some reason. You open your door, your daughter comes in, your toddler comes in, she shows you her macaroni art, and lo and behold, the macaroni art is a butterfly, right? Those are not necessarily connected events, but in your mind, you might see them as connected, and you might see that as having some larger significance. And so as I use the term synchronicity here, it is to refer to the simultaneous occurrence of change where it's not clear that there's any causal relationship between those reforms. And so, for example, the 16th and the 17th Amendment. And so the former reinstated, and I say reinstated intentionally, but reinstated Congress's power to impose an income tax to fund a modern government. The latter, the 17th Amendment, as you know, because I know you had a talk on this recently, at least, or someone speak to you about it, was the direct election of senators, right? And so the former was proposed 3 years before the latter. So we get this proposal, it's kind of sitting around. It's not clear whether it's even going to be ratified. Constitutional amendments are typically ratified in faster time. And so that is proposed 3 years before you get the proposal of the 17th Amendment. And lo and behold, they are ratified within months of each other, 2 months of each other. And so one might see this unified theme, and indeed I see this theme and my co-author sees this theme, that you can connect these two. You can think about the income tax and the direct election of senators in this theme of sort of government control and oligarchy, right? You have an oligarchic and corporate class not paying their fair share on the one hand into the nation's sort of treasury. And on the other hand, you have a Senate that is equal parts corrupt and gridlocked and absent. And so we can connect those things, but it's not clear that one led to the other. And so this Senate that was selected by state legislators, we can connect the sort of corruption going on there. But, one might also see this as asynchronous, right? This is not actually causally connected. But what I take from this is something, in the wise words of the scientist Louis Pasteur, luck favors the prepared, right? And so synchronicity in this context would suggest that opportunities often present themselves outside of one's control. And so we should be ready for accidents. The second S is symbiosis. And so if synchronicity and constitutional change is largely about chance, then symbiosis is more about choice. And so a symbiotic relationship can be mutually beneficial for the parties involved. And so consider, again, an example from science, corals and algae. In nature, corals grow in ways that often offer the shelter and vital nutrients for other organisms, including algae. And during photosynthesis, you get algae producing oxygen, sugars, and other nutrients that become available for the corals to use. And so they're working together in this symbiotic relationship. And I draw on this in our context to emphasize that movements can be more than concurrent. They can be complementary. And so this suggests that a strategy that concerns a strategy for constitutional amendment can come through coalition, it can come through coordination and communication with other movements. And so it might create some truth in the interlocking nature of the fates that synchronicity might suggest is existing, something beyond mere perception or coincidence. And so, again, think about the movements for abolition and equal citizenship and political rights for Black Americans that were bound up together. There was overlap in the groups and the persons working on the one and the others. And so we see those as symbiotic relationships. Similarly, for the 18th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, right? We get the temperance movement, we get the suffrage movement. Many of the suffragists were also members of the temperance movement. And so I'm going to say something. I've never been a fan of this sort of neoliberal quote that a rising tide lifts all boats. I say that even more reluctantly talking to this group that is thinking about inequality and how that affects our political sort of system overall. Seems a little awkward. And yet, in the case of amendments, sometimes they might. Sometimes one movement can make room for another. And then the third one is solidarity. And this one, I think, is extremely important, but sometimes disregarded, because once we are in the course of our own work and our own movements for change, we can really be pretty narrow-minded about it. But solidarity says that we should be thinking and working and sort of in concert with other movements. And that's cyclically as well, right? We should be standing together, working with impacted communities and their allies for the types of change that we're going to do. And that sort of solidarity is itself present throughout the history of constitutional change as well. Importantly, suffragists and the people fighting for Black political rights, they really did cut their teeth in the same fights, right? They stood in solidarity, and there were points of divergence, to be clear. And that is something that was kind of cyclical, because you see something like that mirrored, something that existed during this Reconstruction period where you have both the fight for Black political rights and women's political rights. You see that mirrored in the civil rights era 100 years later, where you have the movement for Black rights again, and then the movement for women's rights. Sometimes their strategies coincided, sometimes they were at each other's necks. And, it was those times where they were at each other's necks that made each of the movements that much more difficult. I don't want to make this seem like it's all roses and sweetness here, right? Because you understood that's not the way that politics works. And so what I want to do is to just quickly highlight that each of those S's that I've discussed also have these potential downsides. So, for example, putting too much reliance on synchronicity, this idea, it might have us wishing for serendipitous events. It might foster in us a hopeful idleness in lieu of instilling in us the value of hard work and insistence. Moreover, we can think about symbioses, right? They can be mutual, but they can also be parasitic. Movements might end up being conflictual, sapping the energy and resources from each other instead of reinforcing each other with material support. And solidarity, the problem there is that it can often be superficial or merely symbolic, instead of being sincere and well-intentioned. And so I highlight these things as forces that we need to be thinking about in terms of values for an effective movement. But I also want to highlight them that if you're not being thoughtful about them, or if you are not being thoughtful enough about them while you are doing them, you could fall victim to one of the pitfalls, which is the other side of the coin. So for me, I think about this sort of and I don't want to keep your time for too long. I know I kept you waiting, and I'm very, very sorry about that. But I think about what's going on today and how Move to Amend might think going forward. Citizens United came nearly 15 years ago, and I feel like everyone, lots of people just across the board are disgusted by that opinion. And you peel back the layers and go back further in time to look at Buckley v. Vallejo. people on all sides of the political spectrum just are, riled up by this. But they're riled up by other things going on too. And so synchronicity would say to me to take advantage of those other things that are riling people up, right? I mentioned back during the 1800s when you get two electoral college misfires electing a wrong president. We've seen those again today, and people are mad, and we should build on that. We saw in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, or the sort of response that we got in local levels and federal levels for changes towards police practices, towards Black people, and incarceration legislation, things like that. We saw movements regarding Me Too and Time's Up and the Women's March happening in the wake of some of the most deplorable behavior we've seen sort of in the last who knows how when, and that's still continuing if we're following the news. We can pick out any number of names, big names, showing that these are still important and these are still underway. And most recently, we've seen the protest activity around the No Kings movement, which I think is, it's both a great thing, but it's a little unfocused. And it's a little unfocused in the ways that the ones that I just mentioned are also a little unfocused. Their focus was on some sort of immediate response as opposed to something that is going to be enduring and coherent and something, I guess, that we would think of having the Constitution as a North Star, right? It needs to be a movement that is actually tied up with and sort of entrenched with and sort of supported by the values of our Constitution. And so to sort of either whether we want to talk about redeeming the Constitution or restoring the Constitution, what we need to be looking at is these other movements trying to work alongside them, work with them, and stand in support of them if we're to effectuate our own goals. And so I'm going to end there because I know I'm not technically ending. I'm going to stick around for as long as you'd like to do some Q&A if you like, or have further discussion as would be helpful for you.
Yeah, Professor, thank you very much. And yes, I told everybody that you would be around for a while for Q&A. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask the first question, although I think you actually already answered it. So I'll go on to something else. Recently, there's been increased attention by legal scholars and the media about having an open constitutional convention. That is, one that would recommend changing the entire Constitution, not just individual amendments. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts. I think there are a lot of things in the Constitution that need reform. I just mentioned a bunch of things. I'm sure you all have things that you're thinking about too. I mentioned the Supreme Court and the decisions there. It's not just sort of the Supreme Court and sort of the decisions that it has, but the institution itself, the ethics problems that have been swirling around it, that sort of lack of adherence to stare decisis and other constraints, the politicization of the court itself, including by its own members, and things like that. There are a number of other things I think need to be amended, and so there is room for big thought here. I don't think, however, that the Constitutional Convention is the mode there. And I think the problem there is just the lack of answers that mode actually provides. It's never really been deemed to be a serious mode since the Constitution itself was sort of ratified. That early period during the Bill of Rights, it was always thought to be a threat and a possibility. But beyond that, it's been around, but it's just never been able to effectuate things. And the reason for that is clear, because there are no rules around this. And so what we actually get from a constitutional convention, who is actually going to be elected or chosen, even if there are elections as delegates, what is going to be on the agenda, who is going to influence that agenda? Is it going to be the big money in politics that you are trying to fight right now that will actually shape that agenda? And the list just goes on. And so I think, I think it is noble to be thinking outside of the box because, desperate times call for desperate measures. And I think we are in pretty dire times. But I do think that, the Pandora's box is a different one. And that's the one that I would stay away from. That is the Pandora's box of the convention.
Okay. Alfonso, do you have questions ready?
At this
Okay.
point, there are no questions that haven't been answered in the chat yet. I just shared the instructions for people. If they have questions, they can either, there we go. They can either raise their virtual hand or just type in the question in the chat and we'll get to them. But I see Moji has his hand up.
I think there were a couple of questions just came in. Would you like to read them?
Let me scroll. Let me find it. Oh, yeah. Since corporations are legal fictions, whose power stems from the states, and how do we feel about actions at the state level actions, such as the Montana Plan?
Yes. So one of the other things that I did not mention in terms of things that catalyze constitutional amendment is activity at the state level. And so states themselves, under our system of federalism, have their own constitutions, their own forms of government, and they experiment all the time. And so I think that states are incredibly important in this whole discussion. One, you're going to need state support on the back end to ratify amendments. And so you really are encouraged to get sort of state level activity on your substantive areas sort of going and underway. And I've written a paper recently where I call it Springboard to Article 5, which kind of looks at the history of this, right? There have been periods where state level reforms have actually catapulted us to national level reforms, including in the amendment context. And we can think about a lot of amendments. And when you do, you start thinking about all the corollaries that existed in one, many, or most states at any time that preceded it. And so I would say one of the ways to think about this movement activity and to try to foster a movement is also to start small. You can think about these small ball amendments at the local and state level and then try to work your way up at top.
Go ahead, Alfonso.
Yeah, from Eric, he is asking if a multifaceted constitutional amendment could be a broad movement organizing focused similarly to the core values of a third party. We are a country mostly of the independence, organizing from the middle to the out, guessing out. And then there is another question from David. How often have there been term limits to ratify amendments by 3/4 of the states? Are the limits justified?
So I hope I'm answering the questions correctly, or I heard them correctly. So the first question, we are trying to figure out, or sorry, let me start with the second one first. So the second one, you want to know if the process is too difficult, my view. Is that what we're kind of getting at?
They want to know how often have the limits been ratified to amend the Constitution.
Yeah, so I'll say this. This is one way to think about it, is once an amendment is proposed, it has a pretty good shot of being ratified. That's at least what our history has shown, right? Because now it's difficult to get the proposal out there. There have been thousands and thousands of proposals over time. But once those proposals have actually been made, they've cleared the bar in the House of Representatives and the Senate, those extraordinary supermajorities. 27 out of 33 of them went on to be ratified. I can talk to you about the 6 that were not ratified. Some of them were just ill-conceived. Some were ill-timed. But generally, that at least what the history shows is once you get out of Congress, it takes a pretty high level of support in Congress to get out there anyway. You probably got more support than you've sort of started with it at the outset, right? And by getting through Congress, actually, you are building more support, right? Because what it takes to get through Congress is lots of advocacy, lots of communications and messaging. In today's age, you'd have a whole sort of social media blitz and things like that, right? You're doing the work the whole time while it's going through Congress, and that's going to foster, it's going to have legs. Now, I want to try to get back to the first question. If you would repeat that one, I want to make sure that I'm answering.
There was a second part to that first question, which was, are time limits justified?
Are time limits justified?
Yeah, which is the ERA. That's the big, obviously, debate around the ERA.
Yeah, I mean,
Right, and also,
I don't. I'm sorry, go on.
I just thought I brought up the question initially, and yeah, related to the Equal Rights Amendment, and I mean, was that unusual to set a time limit to it for ratification? I mean, have other amendments required that? I mean,
so it's not unusual, and if you actually go back to the 18th Amendment, I believe that might have been the first one to impose a 7-year time limit, and so it became reasonably customary. I think there were a few after the 18th Amendment that did not include a time limit, and so they've been there. And so I'm going to tell you what some of the erstwhile suffragists said. If you're taking too long, you're probably not going to have a great chance. So are they justified? I think they're justified in some ways, right? We want to have the idea, you want to have some sort of, coincidence, like more than coincidence, between the will of the people that kind of got this to push and the legislators sort of lagging afterwards. At the same time, when you have this extraordinary of a threshold, maybe the time limits are less justified, or longer time limits would be better. The Equal Rights Amendment was very unique in many regards because it touched on this from many angles. It raised questions about who had the power to extend time limits. The judiciary tried to come in where there is no real judicial role in amendment politics in the first instance. As I said, the Supreme Court is often the reason why we amend the Constitution to undo what it does. So it's kind of weird to bring the Supreme Court in and start thinking about whether the amendments were done well, right? We're trying to respond to you, and yet you're still the referee about our response to you. And so the ERA raised a lot of concerns about time limits. I go both ways about whether they are justifiable. I am becoming less, I think so less, given how that threshold is, how high that is. But at the same time, like, I'm still deeply of the sense that if you're not doing it quickly, it's just going to linger and it won't succeed. And that is, right after the 19th Amendment was ratified, you get the suffragists pushing for the ERA. In 1923, I believe, was the first year that it was introduced. And when you finally get that proposed, you get a dying suffragist saying, because if it's not ratified in the year, it's not going to be ratified. And that, I think, is pretty wise. You can see that there was this conservative backlash in the 1970s to what they saw as the excesses of the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement and the gay rights movement and the movements, those important social movements of the 20th century. But I think, however you feel about time limits, the time is ticking. Amendment windows are quick, and they're quick to close.
Okay, and I'll let Eric raise his question. Eric, if you're there.
What I was wondering about, and this may be a premature question, is could a constitutional amendment that had 7, 8 clauses to it as a way of putting a laundry list of issues that would capture what I would say the independent center of the country is and push out into the Democratic and Republican parties around issues where there's some large agreement that the issue needs to be addressed, but we can morally differ on the best way how to do that. And we're free to organize on that basis, independent, and to take the state out of it would be like taking more seriously the freedom of religion as a freedom of way of life. So you protect all the DEI concerns, but you protect also very conservative religious groups at the same time for their freedom, for their free exercise of religion. And you allow them to organize across boundaries, which is something they don't have necessarily if you go outside of the state, to actually organize at a scale that could make living well, whether you're trans or gay or any particular group that wants to cooperate together. Could there be a place for such a laundry, Chinese menu laundry list of changes that might capture people's attention and move this thing along?
I think that is a double-edged sword.
I guess sure.
That's both a place where there's possibility, and so think about the 14th Amendment, for example.
That's exactly
that is one of the longest amendments. It's a laundry list of amendments. They kind of gel together given the historical period in which they came, but if you look at them separately, they're not necessarily connected, right? And so what that did is like you interlocked the fates of those who wanted one provision and the other provision, right? And so you made them have to give a thumbs up or thumbs down on that. That said, it does take longer time to sort of corral that sort of group or coalition around something that's omnibus in that way, because some may not support these other features of it or are not as strongly. And then also just the conversation and the discussion to kind of hash those different provisions out is itself a project.
Unless it's driven by fear. And we are at a moment where fear levels are incredibly high across the political spectrum. And fear can force strange bedfellows.
And so I was going to say there's another example we have in the 25th Amendment. Now, that wasn't really movement based, and it is mostly about the presidency, but it's also about other stuff like the continuity of government and the succession to the presidency. And then also what happens if you have a disabled president who cannot actually do the job. That is also a very long amendment. And again, all about the presidency, mostly we put it under the sort of umbrella of succession, but then there's also other things going on there, and there's different aspects of succession, right? And so there, what you had was a bunch of people who sort of agreed that you needed some sort of amendment like this, but they didn't agree on what that amendment should be. And that came in a time of fear because that came in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination. Kennedy, we're in the middle of this Cold War. You want an alert hand on the nuclear button, what have you. All of that stuff seemed really scary. And so that did force some activity. People said, look, this is not my ideal, but I need something better than what we have now. And so you can do that, and it can have both effects. I think a lot of it depends on exogenous factors, the sort of scope of things. The one thing you do want to be thoughtful about is to, I think there's ways to write amendments using language that is broad enough to encapsulate a lot of the concerns of a lot of people. But you want to make sure that that is not conflictual. You don't want to have this inner tension because you will have wasted an entire movement on something that a court or political actors are just going to read as in conflict, right? And so I think that's the thing you want to be cautious about. You can have an omnibus amendment. I think that can be strategic. You just want to be thoughtful that it does at least flow towards these same broader ends.
Can I follow up with just quickly? Can you have a amendment that identifies where conflicts will occur, but it's not a conflict within the amendment?
Certainly. Yeah. Yeah, and if you perceive that, I think people, you can have these whereas and sort of however and what have you sort of conjunctions to make sure you're clarifying in ways where you perceive that there's conflicts. And I want to be clear, we can't think about every eventuality that's going to come out of amendments. And so we can't perfectly draft or even conceptualize an amendment, and we can't foresee every conflict that might arise, right? Some people would have never thought about the 14th Amendment being both about, color blindness, but also restoring and some racial justice, right? We could never, I mean, maybe we could have seen it, but like that's where we are today. And so those are the things you just want to be thoughtful while you're doing it, knowing that, it's a challenge.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
I'm going to jump in here for a second. There were several questions about the Montana plan, Professor Codrington, and this is the one that is being advocated in Montana to try and do an end run around Citizens United by reincorporating corporations, but without the power to give political donations to corporations. Are you familiar with that, and do you have any opinion about it?
So I'm vaguely familiar with it. I'm aware of it. I haven't looked very deeply into it, and I'm going to be frank. I am an election law scholar, and so I think about this all the time. And probably the First Amendment and the Citizens United money and politics part is probably the most frustrating aspect of it all to me in some regards. And there's a lot of frustrating things in election law. And that is just because the entirety of the fiction around it has allowed it to have the legs that it has had, right? That money is politics. It's not even money allows for politics. This money is politics at this point, right? And so, and the idea of this corporate personhood, and there's, that was something that also came out of sort of a fluke. After the 14th Amendment, you get a former member of Congress who is now a corporate titan or working for the corporate side saying that, oh yeah, when we were writing the 14th Amendment, we were talking about persons, we're also talking about corporations, right? And so there's a lot of fictions going around there that just made it sort of really frustrating. My fear, I like the idea of workarounds. I think workarounds are great to the extent that they work. But, the Supreme Court, to the extent that they hear challenges to these things, are typically a little hostile to the idea of circumventing the Constitution. Now, that's not always the case. It really kind of depends on the Supreme Court. If you remember, there was a law in Texas that basically, before Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Dobbs decision, was allowing Roe v. Wade to be functionally nullified by the state, right? That they were able to get around that. And so that kind of circumvention, you would think the Supreme Court would have stepped in to stop. Lo and behold, it was considering overruling Roe v. Wade at that time, and it just let it slide for a bunch of months. I think the First Amendment jurisprudence of this court is pretty wild. And so, and I also think the sort of corporatocracy that kind of characterizes this court is pretty wild. And so, yes, I think there is wisdom in trying something like the Montana approach or any other way, like the National Popular Vote Compact around the Electoral College. I think that one has actual doctrinal possibilities that it could work. But I also, would be thoughtful of the fact that we do live in a judicial supremacy. And so, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying. We should be doing all of these things because that is what's going to catalyze the movements. That may end up moving a couple justices. You think about the switch in time that staved 9, right? All of these sorts of things, they do have an effect. And so it doesn't mean don't try them. I'm just very, very, very skeptical of the Supreme Court on a number of these issues, including anything that has to do with the First Amendment, whether it's the fiction or not, and corporations, including the fiction that is that they are people.
Alfonso, can we make sure that everybody who has either their hand up or has asked a question, we can try and get to them before we finish up?
Yeah, I think from the chat, the only other
Can I just,
comment.
sorry, I just want to follow up really quickly on Montana. Montana is one of these examples that we should really look to because, I mean, and just to Eric's point, right? Like, Montana's not a bunch of raging lefties. That's not the Montana I know or ever known, right? Um, and yet they are one of the leaders on this whole money in politics, and they always have been. And
Mhm.
so it does show that this sort of thing like resonates with people, and it shows that states should be experimenting with these sorts of things to try to test the court and try to push movements in the way. So just like, I mean, even just the Montana plan, just thinking about that just shows you like that there can be strange alliances on these things. There is lots of overlap on a lot of these important issues, and there should be the ability, and we should continue doing the things like this to actually impel the sorts of change that you want, because that is the type of state experimentation that we talk about in our book that has helped catalyze constitutional change.
Okay.
Yep. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can in the time available. If you guys want to type them, that we will ensure to save them all and perhaps forward those to the professor. I see that Mark was asking if the Article 5 amendment process were amended. Do you have any thoughts on how the amendment process could be improved?
How much time do you have? um, Look, I mean, if I'm a constitutional theorist, I live in a world where I'm sort of critiquing what's going on in our problems and think about what are the possibilities there, what would make it better in theory, whether or not we think about it as feasible in the long term or not. And so I guess if I were to think about improving it, first I would change the threshold. I just think it's impossible, possibly hard at this point. And so like over time, that threshold has gotten meaningfully harder just because we've added more states, and we added more states in a diverse country. And so just the denominator problem becomes more of a problem. It's harder to reach 2/3 of Congress than it is when we had a smaller Congress. It is harder to reach 3/4 of the states when we've had fewer states. And so that just is difficult. So I would change that entirely and knock that down. What that would be, I'm not sure. Now, if I really could draw on some other things, two things I would think about, and I could go on forever, but two things I would think about. One is direct democracy. All states have some type of direct democracy, right? And many states require the people to speak on a ratification of state constitutional amendments. I think the problems about direct democracy are real. We don't want to be overrun by majorities all the time and having them trample on the rights of political minorities or racial minorities, what have you. And I think that those are real. And so we think about what that threshold would be if we had a ratification by direct democracy. The other thing is, instead of just having one threshold, we might have several thresholds for amending the Constitution, depending on how important the matter is that we want to amend. And so, for example, I think racial equality is pretty important. And so it might be a higher burden to eliminate or amend racial equality. Now, maybe we think about other things as having less importance in our society, and so maybe there's a lower one. That's what one scholar calls tiered constitutional design, and so it makes it harder for some things and easier for other things. And, I think all of these things, what I'm talking about in terms of these potential ideas for altering the whole amendment process, what I think the important thing about these ideas in this conversation is that it moves us away from this idea of framer worship and veneration, right? And so I think one of the things that is the most difficult things to overcome, it's hard because of the number of states. I just talked about that denominator problem over time, but there's also the psychic problem of getting over the impossibility of amending. And part of that comes with the threshold being so high, and part of it just comes with people just not talking about possibilities. I think, more conversations gets people more involved. questioning or allying, however you think about it, but it moves them away from this idea that we have a perfect constitution. Like, remember, the Constitution is supposed to be creating a more perfect union, more perfect, meaning that we're supposed to be evolving into more perfection over time. And so I think these conversations, including talking about the problems with the amendment process, it's important because it tells us that the framers weren't perfect themselves. And we know that. We know that in our hearts. Half of those men owned people. Most of them did not respect women. And they're just things that we just know are not, make them imperfect. And so I think, those are the changes that I would think about, at least a few up front. But I think kind of having the conversation about constitutional change, including changing how we change the Constitution, is important to help propel the ability to see that change.
Yeah, very true. And perhaps on that note, Margaret raises a question regarding synchronicity and symbiosis and how the racism of the anti-immigrant actions of the federal government have endangered a lot of grassroots action. And she wonders how can we draw connections with Move to Amend or for
Yeah, that is difficult. And I'm talking, as someone whose partner is an immigrant. And so I think about this stuff all the time. But I'm in New York. We see these protests. Or I'm not in New York right now. Right now I'm in Dallas, but generally I'm in New York. I think that part of this is the aim. And so we have to think about that, right? Part of the reason why you go after why a president or a politician might call out particular groups and to particular vulnerable people is to stop them from actually engaging in a way that is productive and reform focused. And so you just have to realize that that is part of the problem. And you have to realize that that means that we probably have to do more. We have to use our own privilege and power to do the things that will be helpful for those communities in addition. And so that's the solidarity aspect. I do want to ensure that what that doesn't turn into, that solidarity and that trying to encouragement, even trying to build those coalitions, doesn't turn into sort of paternalism or co-opting, right? You don't want to sort of push and say, this is for the voice of the immigrants without actually working with immigrant people, right? Like that's something you want to avoid because it is going to create much more friction and clashes in your process. It's going to set you back. It's inauthentic, and you might not actually be doing something that is actually beneficial. You want to sort of work in collaboration. I do think these crackdowns are intentional, though, and so not everybody is afraid. They are worried about this, but some people, even despite their vulnerability to these crackdowns, are still out there doing that. And so I think we need to lift those people up, step back and let them take the lead when that is possible, step forward and put ourselves on the line when we can help protect. And that is all in the name of continuing this process and continuing this movement going forward and into other movements. But I'm concerned. I'm really, really concerned about, this sort of targeting, because I do think that's the point, to make this even harder.
Thank you. Greg, I see you put in a question there in the chat. Would you like to raise it up for the professor?
Why don't we go to Moji first?
Oh, yeah, Moji. Let's see. You should be able to unmute.
Thank you, and thank you, Professor Codrington, brother Wilfred. My name is Moji Aga. I'm in Boulder, Colorado. I'm an Iranian American immigrant, and first of all, I want to invite you to be a speaker for a bilingual, binational town hall that I organize every other week. And Greg has been one of our early guests in this process. And I'll send you information. I'd like to invite you. And the question that I have is quoting the head or the director, the Inside Iran director of Peace-Seeking Iranian Veterans, of which I am the founder here in the United States. And once he became aware that there are so many civil society organizations in this country. Like he heard 800 from one of our speakers. He says, what's wrong with you folks? You have the freedom to organize. Here in Iran, they suppress any attempt at organizing. We, the people, organizing, the regime does. So he says, what's wrong with you? And part of what I've been saying is that we don't have the infrastructure for systemic collaboration across different movements in the civil society. And I call that chambers of compassion in contrast with chambers of commerce. And I wish I had time to talk, but I believe that infrastructure is missing. But people with money and power have realized they need to build that infrastructure. One of them is called the familiar Chamber of Commerce, but we don't have a chamber of compassion or intersectional circles. So thank you for what you're doing. I invite you to peace-seeking Iranian veterans so that you can hear people from inside Iran in live conversation. So thank you.
I appreciate all of that and what you said. And I think, you're right, Moji, that we don't have enough sort of compassion, which I think, speaks about the infrastructure and the bridges that we need to be building. Bridges I'm using sort of metaphorically, but in sort of relation to your infrastructure point, right? We have to build that infrastructure. It is up to us to build that infrastructure. There are wealthy people who benefit from the status quo who will maintain a very well-oiled sort of machinery to make sure that you don't, right? But we also are more connected in ways that we've never been in human history. And so that is the thing. Who would have ever thought that some hashtag Me Too would turn into a movement, or some hashtag Black Lives Matter would turn into a movement, or some hashtag, the 99% or 99%, right? These are all sorts of things that could not have caught fire in the earlier parts of our history in the ways that it had, because of the way that our technology has developed. And, some of that is just like very cheap now. And so we need to be thoughtful about what we can use at our disposal now to continue to build more infrastructure. And that is going to take time, that it's going to take resources, it's going to take money. And so part of those are all important parts of a movement, though. Raising that money, building those coalitions, putting in the time, making sure you have the resources to continue that, to start with the sort of, and we should not also think about this as an ending thing. If we were fortunate, if we were hard enough, working enough to actually see an amendment to overturn Citizens United and Buckley, that does not mean the fight is over. And so that's the other thing, right? Like that part of that compassion that you're talking about building is like sort of related to this solidarity point, right? We need to be empathetic to the fact that like our own immediate concerns, or what we see as the largest concern, may just be one of the largest concerns and may not be the immediate concern from someone else. And so we need to think about this holistically, build these bridges between different organizations and civil society, and sort of work towards like a more perfect union in this way that would actually effectuate a lot of goals and better us across many planes.
I think we need to jump in here and let the good professor go. If you didn't have a question answered, please leave it in the chat and we'll impose upon Professor Codrington's good graces to get some answers after the fact, but he hasn't had a break since he arrived in his hotel room.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
I had put it in the chat and just wanted to share it if I might. I don't know if you're familiar with George William Van Cleve and his work around making a new American Constitution, the book. And basically the argument there is, although I don't know if he uses this term, but you may be familiar that in authoritarian societies, there are things called shadow governments that operate in parallel to the existing formal. Now, you have expressed concerns which we concur with in terms of not wanting at the moment to call for a formal Article 5 convention. Do you have the same concerns, though, about holding sort of an organized, informal constitutional convention, of trying to get people together that cross the political spectrum, come up with their ideas for significant constitutional renewal that could be more than just a couple at a time? And by doing so, both that achieves two purposes. One, it visions what would a new constitution, or dramatically different constitution, be, and include that reflects the needs of today, so we're not piecemealing this, but also, just as importantly, if not more importantly, culturally breaking down this bugaboo about, oh my God, Constitution is just too important, or it's a third rail, that we need and should have the power and the right to be involved and engaged. And we're practicing that by doing this right now. That could be a stepping stone to breaking down this cultural bugaboo we have about having a formal constitutional convention that could lead actually to that down the road. That would be more democratic, because we're building a movement as we're riding the bicycle. As we're building it, we're amending the Constitution and making a new American Constitution as we're doing it.
So I am all for this idea of having deliberative bodies thinking about this. I think Congress could constitute some working groups and commissions to actually do this sorts of things. They've done it in the past. Think about the changes that we saw in gender equality over the 1960s and 70s. That came after, obviously it wasn't only this, but after a presidential commission on the sort of status of women. We've seen things like this across the board, even the changes that we got in the civil rights era. We got those after presidential commissions. And I'm not saying only presidential commissions, because sometimes you say presidential commission, it becomes a laughing joke, right? I want something that's going to do stuff. And I just wonder.
Blue ribbon commissions.
Right. I'm not asking for just some blue ribbon commission. I'm asking for something and almost anything to actually foster the debate, to actually facilitate these things. Now, and I think you raise a good point, which is that, sometimes piecemeal change is not the best thing, right? And, in some ways, we have a constitution that sort of fights with itself, because we did amend it in these piecemeal ways and across these different time periods, and we're trying to have a mishmash work together. I think the problem is that Americans largely stand for most of those sort of big picture ideas across most of those generations, but to different points. And I think, trying to think about what a new constitution would look like is a good and worthy project. Trying to think about how you might implement something like that is also a good and worthy project. But right now, I think that sometimes goes beyond, there's imagination and there's imagination. And I guess I'm just wondering which we should be doing, because amendment politics themselves are long-term things, and there are sort of, I think, approaches to catalyze this that can be sort of an all of above answer, right? And so, let's get some bodies together talking about that. I am concerned that putting together something that would be this sort of mock convention might tell people that, there's this Article 5 group on the right that is doing this sort of thing. But, I've looked at these things, and what they're doing is they're getting a bunch of people together who agree on a bunch of stuff, including even the rules. And then they'll argue about these minor little things, and they're like, oh, well, we just solved it. This is what it would look like. And that is not what it would look like. And so I don't want to put out some false hope that because we got some people in a room together, including self-selecting people who probably are prone to agree with each other in first instance, that is going to foster deliberation. And so any sort of body or commission or convention or convening or whatever we want to call about this assembly needs to be a sort of real cross-section of American life. It needs to be sincere and earnest, and really, I think most importantly, it needs to be doing all of this in the name of the people, not themselves, and these sort of solipsistic ideas, these self-serving sort of views. And those are the things that I'm afraid of that would and could come out of an actual Article 5 convention. But for me, testing all this stuff out in the earlier parts, doing all this stuff beforehand, is doing nothing but fostering conversation that could be beneficial. And so more conversation, the better. The more people getting together to talk, the better. I'm just, again, just thoughtful about what kind of rules are possible and those sorts of things, especially when we're trying to do it, formal amendments through it.
Well, on that note, Alfonso, please save the chat. And Professor
Please.
Codrington, thank you so very much for putting in even extra time after your travails with the airlines. This has been very helpful and very stimulating, and we very much appreciate you hanging in there with us and finally making this happen. So we'll be in touch, but thank you so much.
And just
Yes, and please do send me the chat. I am now on my tablet, which is going to make it difficult for me to save it. But if you would forward that along to me, I'd love to think about these things and send them back.
Yeah, and just a note that this has been recorded. We will send the recording out to not only the individuals who were on this call, but there were about 190 people who registered. Everyone will get that and will be encouraged to share it, both near and far. So please do that.
All right.
Thanks for being on.
Thank you again for having me. Thanks for bearing with me and being patient. And I love chatting with y'all, and I'm so supportive and in solidarity with the work you're doing. So continue to keep up the good work.
Okay. Thank
You
you.
too.
Thank you. You as well.
Okay.
You too.
Good night.
Bye-bye now.
They out here stripping our democracy, piece by piece, city by city, state by state. Voter ID laws, emergency financial managers, Citizens United. We gotta fight it. Move. Corporations are not people, too. Money is not speech. Man, in fact, it's the root of all right now. We have the right to be free. Move. Corporations are not people, too. Money is not speech. Man, in fact, it's the root of all right now. Stand up and defend your democracy.
Have you recently read the Constitution? There seems to be some type of confusion. I thought it said the people were the institution and not the corporations that simply want to use them. The truth is currently a fusion of corporate loot and our government that is outright abusive. People need change. The state, it refuses. They're saying we're mistaken. Well, show us where the proof is. They control the media, movies, and the music, and determine where supplies of the water and food live. We need a strategy. Here is a solution. Build a movement to give our rulers improvements. An infusion of human to counteract the hubris that has our ecosystem near useless and our youth pissed. The founding fathers were flawed, but they knew this, so they gave us the tools to move with. Let's use them.
Move. Corporations are not people, too. Money is not speech. Man, in fact, it's the root of all right now. And it's time to take to these streets. Move. Corporations are not people, too. Money is not speech. Man, in fact, it's the root of all right now. So get on out of your seats.
Citizens United is the lie. Corporation doesn't know life, nor does it die. Profits from the 100 richest fictions alone in 1 year can make all of poverty gone. The Republicans are lost. Democrats bought. Most American people have forgotten that we fought for healthcare, education, services, and safety. It wasn't kindness, it was war that ended slavery. Not advocating violence, I am saying that lately a lot of folks is dying in ways that seem shady. A lot of students is hiding from debt that they can't beat and asked to be excited about a future they can't see. It's not a climate crisis, it's a corporate crisis, because a corporation can never know what life is. Only a human can. What's the solution then? Amend the Constitution or it's revolution, man?
Corporations are not people, too. Money is not speech. Men, in fact, it's the root of all right now. To us to educate and to reach. Corporations are not people, too. Money is not speech. Men, in fact, it's the root of all right now. Which side of the fence you find your feet?
Hip hop never died. The corporation stole it and told us with bonus that we never owned it. They just loaned it out for the moment. It's a policy and culture matrix. When corporations shape it, only the prophets hold it sacred. Though they stole to make them, we don't have the convenience of giving up. Gotta swallow all of the real, even if it comes from sippy cups. It's not a matter of political correctness. It's a matter of having the knowledge of what respect is. You can't defend humanity without joining it. This is our responsibility. Let's stop avoiding it. Instituting love as a practice and overcoming the fascists to achieve the democratic, economic, and ecological collapse. I am not being neurotic. I simply offer the fact. We the people are under a monster's attack. It's time to rise, open the eyes, and take our democracy back.
Ooh, corporations are not evil. Ooh, money is not speed. In fact, it's the root of all right now. We will not admit defeat. Ooh, corporations are not evil. Ooh, money is not speed. In fact, it's the root of all right now.